Okay, welcome everyone. Thanks very much for having me here. I've got about an hour and a half, 20 minutes, to tell you a little about a project that I was very lucky to be part of a couple of years ago. By way of a quick introduction to those who haven't met me, I worked on South Georgia for the government for 25 years. Martin was my boss for a while, and I finished there in 2017. Luckily, soon after, got involved with this project. So South Georgia is only been known about for about 250 years, so not very long at all. So up until Captain Cook discovered it in 1775, it had really not had any human interference at all. He wasn't very complimentary about it, but he did report that there were a lot of whales and seals around, which led immediately to high levels of exploitation by people who disappeared down there very, very quickly and started hunting the seals almost to extinction and had a good go at the whales as well. So we really don't have a great history of the human management of the place until recently. That stopped. And the fishing didn't really kick off until it was time, until we knew enough about it to control it well, which Peter's just been telling us about. However, those early visitors, the whalers and the sealers, came down in ships. It wasn't very well charted, and so there were a lot of shipwrecks. And with ships, you get rats. And so the rats came ashore and infested the island. There not being any trees on it, it meant that most of the smaller birds burrow and either nest under the ground or at ground level, which makes a very, very good place to be a rat. There's lots of food. In rat-free areas, there were more birds, particularly in the top right corner here. You can see the South Georgia pipit, and this is endemic songbird that only exists on South Georgia, so very important that wasn't allowed to go extinct. So in 2011 then, charity South Georgia Heritage Trust and their sister organisation, the Friends of South Georgia Island in the United States, they came to the place and decided that it was going to be worth having a bash at getting rid of the rats. It was a very bold plan. Nothing of this scale had ever been attempted anywhere in the world, and to try and do it in such a remote place, such tricky logistics and unfriendly weather was quite a big ask. But they thought they'd give it a go anyway. So on the map here, you can see the vegetated area of the island, which isn't very much, just these little green fringes, and they were the bits that the rats are most likely to live in. There were a few a little bit further inland, but not very far. And with the majority of the island being covered in permanent ice, that area was definitely rat-free. So it wasn't quite as big a job as it might be. And so the Heritage Trust decided they were going to have a go at getting rid of them. Now, if you've got one or two rats, traps are a good way of doing it. This unfortunate individual decided to take up residence in our kitchen a couple of years ago and didn't last a couple of days. But if you've got an island full of rats, you have to get bigger tools. So the Heritage Trust spent quite a bit of money and bought some helicopters and used some of the equipment from the government as well. And so rather than traps, they used bait. And with the helicopters and these pods that were slung underneath the helicopters, they spread bait right across the island. And the bait was specially formulated for this project by Bell Laboratories, and the active ingredient brodifacoum thins the blood and is very effective at killing rats. Now, for it to work, you need to use GPS technology in your helicopters and have very good pilots. They needed a spreading rate of, I think it's about a few kilograms per hectare, not very much at all, but it needs to be evenly spread. So that means you've got to fly your helicopter at a constant height above the ground, at a constant speed, and in straight lines, staying on those straight lines to make sure you get a very good spread, which is a tall order for a helicopter pilot, particularly in a place like South Georgia. The red lines on this map of the Stromness Bay area are taken from the GPS plots that were recorded from the helicopter pilots. You can see just how good they were at keeping in straight lines, turning around, coming back, turning around, going up again. And you can also see in the more fertile areas where there's a lot more vegetation, they flew twice to double the coverage and make sure they got it. And it meant that at the end of the day, they could check each map and check if they hadn't left any gaps and go back and fill in any if they needed to. The project was also made easier by the glaciers on the island, which divided it up into these separate coloured zones, which mean that you can just bait one zone, go away for a little while and be confident that the rats won't recover and come back in from the next area. So it was broken up into little chunks, but still big enough chunks. And so the project was spread out over 3 seasons. In phase 1 was just this little area in the middle around King Edward Point on the Thatcher and Green Peninsulas. It was very much a phase of a trial of a phase, trying a whole load of new things, all of which seemed to work. And after that, a lot of monitoring was put in place, looking to see if there were any signs of rats. 2 years later, and the reason we wait 2 years is because if a small remnant population is left, then within 2 years, they will have recovered to the full breeding capacity of that area, which means you can find and detect rats in an area. So after 2 years of monitoring, we decided that that had been successful in that first phase, and then rolled it out to phase 2 in 2013. And 2 years later, in 2015, phase 3. So it took 5 or 6 years, even just to get the baiting done. And then another 2 years to let any rats recover into phase 4, which is where I was very fortunate to be asked to join the team, having finished working on South Georgia and wondering how on earth I was ever going to get back there. I suddenly ended up spending 6 months, which was a very, very fortunate position to be in. So I described earlier that the island had been divided up into a number of baiting zones. And so we used those same baiting zones to survey. And then we had about a dozen zones, and within each zone, we declared a whole bunch of survey areas with the idea that of these 130 odd areas, we were hoping to cover about 75% of them, spread out across the whole island to search for rats. And if we could do that level of monitoring, then we could be pretty confident that the project had worked island-wide. So the project started in October 2017. I flew down to the Falklands. The fishery protection vessel of the South Georgia government transported me down to South Georgia, and I joined the yacht Wanderer 3 with Tis and Kiki, who had come down specifically to assist with the project. It's a very small yacht. They live on it. It's their home. It's all they have. So their entire worldly possessions are already in there. And there's not a lot of space for one extra person, let alone a whole pile of monitoring gear. But we did manage to squeeze it in, and we sailed up the coast, up to the northeast end of South Georgia, northwest end rather, along the northeast coast, so that we could get a start putting some monitoring stations in. The first thing we did was we got up to, well, past Bird Island, round to the south coast into Cole Harbour, next to Undine Harbour, found a lovely little sheltered spot, and Tis spent many hours rowing to and fro, putting out lots of anchors, ground anchors, ropes, and a swivel, which meant that we had a very, very secure anchorage and that they would be prepared to leave the boat all day and be confident that whatever weather came up, she would be okay. So this is the end of the island, the area that we first got into. We anchored in Cole Harbour here, and you can see a few things. The 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 or 8 of the survey areas, and we wanted, remember, to do about 75% of those. So if we could get into 6 of the areas, we were going to be happy. The blue lines are the GPS plots. So we carried a GPS with us the whole time, recording where we'd been. The orange triangles show the monitoring stations, and I'll explain shortly what that is. And they're 200 meters apart. The home range of a rat is about 200 meters. So from his hole, he'll go searching around 200 meters looking for food. So if you've got monitoring devices 200 meters apart, if you've got a rat in the area, he's very likely to come across it at some point. We also used the small tender, the rowing boats, to get out to get ashore to some of the smaller areas, so Grassholm Island, and then with Wanderer we sailed a bit further into Ice Fjord to put a few more stations out. So we did quite a bit of coverage over there. And so here we are, 23rd of October 2017, putting down the first monitoring site, which consists of a stake, a finely planed wooden stake with a couple of devices on it. You can see the triangular wax tag. That's a wax tag that's impregnated with peanut butter. Rats love peanut butter. And then there's a square of corrugated plastic board, which has also got a whole load of peanut butter rammed up the corrugations. The idea being that would tempt the rats. And the bottom half of the stake is painted with vegetable oil. Rats have the front teeth, their incisors constantly grow, and they need to gnaw all the time to wear it down, otherwise they grow too long. So if in a place like South Georgia you put some nice bits of wood out, it's a rare treat for them to have something nice to chew into and wear those teeth down, and it's a very distinctive mark, easy to see. And that's the corrugated board with the peanut butter rammed up it. We did a lot of making of these. We started with huge boards and cut them down, and we, I think we all lost an appetite for peanut butter by the end of the project. It gets everywhere. So this is the sort of thing we'd be looking for on the wax tag, the very distinctive chew mark from those incisors. These are tags that were put out before the project, so that we got a good idea of what we were looking for. So we walked and hiked up and down all around the area, and that was the real treat. The really special part of this project was not only doing something useful, but to get out into the real South Georgia, areas where we go very rarely and cover a lot of ground and see it. And that was an amazing, amazing project, an amazing experience to have. Yes, there's Kiki rowing the boat into Grassholm Island, where she put out 2 stakes. Because they're 200 meters apart, we didn't really need to put out very many. I think we had somewhere just over 1,000, 1,200, something like that across the whole island. And then at the end of that 2 weeks, about the first week of November, we moved our way back down the coast into King Edward Point, and the rest of the team had arrived. There were 8 of us altogether, and they came in on Pharos SG, the government's fishery patrol vessel. We had a lot of help from the South Georgia government on this project, with help with the vessel, accommodation at King Edward Point, and yeah, many other stuff. So here's some more of the team. On the left is Dickie Hall, he was a project manager, Rachel, Matthew, who had been the boatman at King Edward Point, and Becky, who'd been the doctor at King Edward Point. So a lot of strong South Georgia experience. They came in and then they stayed on the ship. They headed down the coast to put out more devices down the other way from where we'd been operating, and they were down at the southwest end of the island. Meanwhile, 4 more of us stayed at King Edward Point, and using the government launches, we were deployed a little way up the coast to Husvik, in the centre of this circle, and that shows the survey area around the Stromness Bay and the number of survey areas we were hoping to cover there. So we were based at the manager's villa in Husvik, and if I'm right, hopefully I can make, yeah, here we are. So here's Husvik, and that's where we were based, in the very nice accommodation building that was the manager's villa when the whaling station was operating, and very comfortable accommodation it was too. So we covered a lot of ground. This is looking down into the station. You can see the sort of terrain we were covering. There's the greenery right in close to the coast, but further inland there's also scrubbier grass, and we had to go up and over various passes to get over to into Fortuna Bay. And we were also helped a lot, again, by Thies and Kiki in the yacht. Operating in the whaling stations, we had to put on full PPE because the stations are riddled with asbestos. And so even before anyone had heard of COVID, we were all very well trained with face masks and PPE. And in the stations, we had a new tool, as well as the usual, we had tracking tunnels. So it's these little plastic boxes, hollow boxes. And in the bottom of these was a white card with black ink and yet another little daub of peanut butter. And the idea is the rats would walk through, gorge themselves on peanut butter and leave inky footprints on the cardboard when we came back a couple of months later to check it. Again, supported by Thies and Kiki, rowing out to Grass Island, this time in Stromness Bay, to go and put some more tags out there. And at the end of it, instead of just doing 3/4 of the survey areas, again, we did pretty well every single one, with the exception of Larsen Point at the very far right-hand edge here, which the guys had realised was just an extension of the crutch area anyway, so they didn't need to go through. The blue tracks, again, are where we walked, so you can see we covered a lot of ground, and the orange triangles are, again, the monitoring stations. So we got a lot of good coverage through the darker green bits here, which are the main vegetated areas. After that, after 2 or 3 weeks there, we then headed back to King Edward Point, had a shower, a couple of shandies with the guys there, packed all our gear up, and then headed across to the Bath Peninsula area. This time we weren't accommodated quite so royally, and the other guys had joined us, so we were now operating in two teams of 4, one at the northern end and one at the southern end. I was part of the team that went down through the southern end, basing ourselves partly on the huts. And here's me with a rucksack full of gear, being able to use huts and tents in 1 or 2 places. We didn't have to carry quite so much equipment with us. You can see I'm carrying here a whole load of stakes and ready to go and deploy even more stakes. Down to Whale Valley, down in Royal Bay, we camped in the tents here. One of the great privileges of this project was the rats were thoughtful enough to be known to hang around wildlife colonies. So a lot of the work was going into the areas where we could just watch the king penguins, the gentoo penguins here, as well as putting the stations out. If we stopped for lunch, there was always something very pleasant to watch. Really, really nice on a good day. We covered a lot of ground, and Roger, one of the team members, decided he was going to risk not buying new boots for the project, and wore his boots out and had to get a bit imaginative after that. This is a completely gratuitous wildlife shot, just because you can't do South George without wildlife. Other than it tells a little bit about the story. In January, when we were doing this section, the beaches, particularly in Hound Bay, were absolutely packed with fur seals, which made getting in and out of the boats, down to the beach for toilet activities quite hazardous. So an amazing backdrop to this project, and here we are putting the very last tag out in St Andrews Bay, having come all the way back up from Royal Bay. A couple of things to note in this picture. Roger has now abandoned his boots and he's wearing his trainers with some rather natty puttees that he's made out of old PPE asbestos proof clothing. Angela is stapling the tag to a stake that you can't see behind her arm. Then Sam on the right is doing probably one of the most important parts of the project, which is recording what we were doing. He's writing down what we've put there, so a stake and a tag and a plastic board, and also plotting it with a GPS so that we know exactly where every single stake is, so that we know where to go back and find it a little bit later. Not so much here, but in other places, the tussock grew over a lot of the tags and made them harder to find, so having a GPS was very useful. It wasn't nice weather all the time, Most people in polar regions recognize that you only get your cameras out when it's nice. So here's one when it was snowy, sleeting and horrible. And you can see my choice of boots is to wear Wellington boots rather than walking boots, which people find quite strange, but that's because a lot of the time you end up crossing streams. And for the sharp-eyed amongst you here, you might see a little black mark on my stick, which is the top of my Wellington, so I can probe ahead and make sure I'm not going to get a boot full of water. So at the end of the Bath deployment, we'd covered all this ground as well and put out stakes, again, in much more than 75% of the ground. And so we got this level of coverage right through the whole length of the island by the end of the year. And then at Christmas, the second phase started. After a few days rest and recuperation, we were joined by the dogs from New Zealand, so Ahu, Will and Y, and their handlers Jane and Miriam. They came to help us, and half of the project was to go right back around the island and to collect all the stakes. And while we were doing that, the dogs were searching. Dogs were amazing, really well trained to completely ignore the wildlife. Quite a few people had been concerned that they might forget what they were doing, go chasing penguins and birds and seals, but they were very, very focused and amazing to see them. And they covered some incredible ground. This map shows back in the Stromness area, the purple line is actually the GPS coverage by the dog handlers. So they went up and down these valleys multiple times. So you can see the dogs are ranging maybe 10, 20 meters each side of this. So covering an incredible amount of ground. Again, a large proportion of the green area of the island. So as we were picking them up, we were looking for, on the stakes, looking for any chew marks. This is the sort of thing we'd be looking for, these very, very clear ridges that are caused by those inside the mark. Again, this is a stake that had been put out back in the days when there still were rats, as was this corrugated tube. Again, the rats had found the peanut butter in it, chewed it all out, and so it makes it very, very easy to see whether you've had rats there. It wasn't completely straightforward though. This wax tag has actually been attacked by a skua. We also had some tags were eaten out by insects, and others were chewed by sheathbills, which had a different peck mark. The skua takes a big chunk, grabs it, and you can see a mark in the top and the bottom, whereas the sheathbill just gives it a few taps, which is a little bit harder to distinguish. But in the end, we had a good look at these marks and got used to the fact that it wasn't rats. The tracking tunnels we looked at, and again, most were clear. We had a little bit of a head scratching session over this one, which was in King Haakon Bay. But in the end, we looked at it all, and particularly Jane and Miriam, who have done a lot of rat work with the dogs and seen this sort of thing before, we all came to the conclusion that this particular one was just insects that had been in and out of the tunnel in a particularly wet and damp area. The fact that the dogs didn't find anything around the area and that the wax tags, etc., hadn't been touched also reinforced that this hadn't been rats. This final section was supported by the Hans Hansen, this 24-meter motor yacht run by Dion Ponce, Juliet and their crewman Frank. Incredible to take us around the island, and such a privilege to work with these people who really, really knew the island. Dion has lived and worked around this area all his life, and what he doesn't know isn't worth knowing. On a rough weather day, we could get into an area, have a look and see some surf along the beach and decide that it's not a goer, and he'd just scratch his head and go, well, there's a little rock just around the corner that gives a bit of shelter, and he always got us in somewhere and picked us up again safely. So again, one of many, many extra people part of the project without which it couldn't have worked. On board a project like this, you can imagine we're working very hard, and the food is really important. And we had the foresight, our project directors had the foresight to employ Ollie, who's a Michelin-starred chef who helped out with Juliet in the kitchen. And the kitchen was a very popular place if you've ever had that feeling you're being watched, that could be because it's the dogs. So to give an idea of the results, the green on this map is the vegetation cover, and all the data for these maps comes free of charge from the South Georgia government, curated by the British Antarctic Survey's mapping people. Really, really incredible resource, very, very useful. So the green is the vegetated areas of the island. These are the survey areas we were hoping to get to, and again, we wanted to get about 3/4 of them done. And these are the survey areas that we actually covered. So I think we did all but maybe 4 or 5. So we got a very, very high coverage compared to what we wanted to do. And the yellow marks on here are the area that was covered by the dogs and by the monitoring devices. And I'm going to go into that in a little bit more detail. So if we zoom in on Hound Bay, again, the green represents the vegetated areas. The orange triangles are the monitoring stations, so the stakes with the wax tags, etc. on. And the blue lines are the dog tracks. Now the rat has a 200-meter range, so if we put in the yellow areas here, which are 200 meters around the dog areas and 200 meters around the wax tags, and clear out those, that shows the yellow area shows that we covered a large proportion of the vegetated area. If there were rats living anywhere in this yellow bit, then we would have found them. And if there were rats living in the green bits and never going to the yellow bits, it would be a very strange situation indeed. So we were very confident that we had covered a really high proportion of the area. While we were at it, we were also looking for key bird species, so small breeding birds. At the beginning and end of every section, we sat for 5 minutes and logged all the small birds we saw, particularly the small ones, because they're the ones that are vulnerable to rodents. And while those surveys are mainly as a baseline for future monitoring, if someone thinks that maybe there are rats in an area, someone can go back and redo the bird surveys and see how it compares. While we were there were definitely, to someone like myself who's been in and around the island for 25 odd years, we were seeing so many more ducks. In 1 or 2 places we saw flocks of pintails, 130 we counted in one flock, so many more than we're used to seeing. So that was a good thing to see. And also the South Georgia pipit, which previously you'd see on the occasional offshore island, maybe flying over right at the end of the summer when they're all looking for new territories. And in a few places on the south coast of the island that had always been rat-free. We saw pipits in every single one of those survey areas. So really, really good sign pipits have recovered. So that's a great sign that it looked, and subsequently an independent island eradication advisory group, a worldwide group of experts who know about island eradications, looked at our results, agreed that, the monitoring that we'd done had been good enough, and the Trust and the South Georgia government in May 2018 were able to declare that South Georgia is indeed rat-free. But that's not the end of the story. The really important thing now is to make sure the rats don't get back. The number of birds have recovered and we want to keep them at a high level. So there's monitoring goes on. Every single fishing ship, every single cruise ship, every vessel that visits South Georgia now has to carry bait stations, which are used for monitoring, and these are inspected. This is back when I had a proper job inspecting monitoring stations on one of the cruise ships. There's a program with the monitoring dogs. Joe mentioned those. Samurai is based in Stanley, and again, every single vessel that's coming to visit South Georgia now has to go to Stanley first and get inspected. And the dog will have a good look around, and is a really good way of finding rats. So that's a really good way of fighting rats, is to take the fight as far upstream as possible and find them before they even leave the port they're coming from. So this is a really, really strong way of doing it in Stanley, in the Falkland Islands. And a third part of the defence is to have a capability on the island of responding quickly if a ship were to come in and say, we've had a bit of an incident and a rat's just gone ashore. So there's a stock of bait, and every year they'll do exercises on the island. And in fact, we did have a rat got in 2014, arrived at King Edward Point, and we were able to go out, distribute a poison across a whole area around, with a lot of monitoring afterwards. And very soon after that, we were able to see that pipits were nesting again up at King Edward Point. And that's the sort of thing we're seeing now. So the whole result of all this work is that South Georgia is now rat-free, available for millions and millions of more birds to be able to burrow in their nests, the pipits to survive. So yeah, a really wonderful project to be part of. So thanks for listening.